I bought that land 30 years ago with the kind of sweat equity most people wouldn't understand unless they spent years digging post holes by hand, cutting trees for their own fence lines, and clearing rocks from earth that didn't want to be tamed. And I did it not for profit or prestige, but for peace. 47 acres of heaven wrapped around the deep blue arms. Oz Lake Marlow, which I dammed and preserved with my own money, my own hands, and the blessing of the original county charter that recognized my private ownership over the water and its surrounding terrain. For decades, I lived in a small cedar cabin on the high ridge, overlooking the lake like a sentinel, content to fish at dawn and work my carpentry shop through the afternoon sun. And if the world wanted to keep spinning out there with cities and subdivisions and HOAs choking the last breath out of freedom, it could. I wasn't part of that. Not until one day, I came back from a 6-month hospital stint in rehab after back surgery and found 35 brand new houses standing where my trees used to be, neatly arranged like some developer's wet dream, complete with cul-de-sacs, street lamps, and glossy vinyl fences, and not one of those houses, not a single nail, had been approved by me or legally permitted on my deeded property. I stood there in a haze of disbelief, my painkillers forgotten in my truck as I walked the shoreline and saw paved roads carved through my forest, retaining walls shoved up against the lake's edge, and families already moving in, laughing, barbecuing, waving like I was just some neighbor instead of the rightful owner whose land had been stolen under his nose. At first I thought it was a mistake, that maybe the county had rezoned something while I was recovering, or that a clerical error had moved boundary lines. But when I went to the county office, I learned something far worse. That an HOA called Marlow Lakeside Community Association had filed permits using doctored plats and AET public easement request forged with a fake signature mine, and had pushed the whole development through, under emergency housing approval, backed by a crooked land use officer who'd since retired and left no trace of the original inspections. I felt the kind of slow, burning rage I hadn't tasted since the war, not the scream and break things kind, but the quiet, surgical kind that studies before it strikes. And when I drove back out and saw a smug man in a blazer standing by a sign that read, Marlow Lakeside, luxury living with nature, I knew exactly where to start. His name was Grant Ellison, HOA president, self-declared visionary, and as he handed me a brochure and welcomed me to our vibrant new neighborhood, I told him exactly who I was, the owner of the lake, the dam, and the shoreline his houses now sat on, and the look on his face shifted from rehearsed politeness to nervous confusion to practiced denial in less than 5 seconds. He called it...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
In less than 5 seconds. He called it a misunderstanding, offered to review the documentation, and then dared to say, "You should be proud your land is worth 10 times what it was before," as if theft became a gift when it was dressed in granite countertops and vinyl siding. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I just nodded, walked back to my truck, and spent the next 4 weeks collecting every record, every blueprint, and every legal document that proved without a shadow of a doubt that this HOA had illegally seized and developed property that was never theirs, never zoned, and never for sale. And once I had it all, I began preparing, not to sue, not to demand back rent, but to reclaim the land the old-fashioned way, by letting nature take it back. I owned the dam had since the 90s, and with one crank of a steel wheel, I could lower the lake by 10 feet, or raise it until it spilled past the old tree line, and that's what I planned to do. Not recklessly, not violently, but with full documentation, permits, and safety protocols. Approved by the County Water Board, which, unlike the Land Office, still had honest men and women who remembered when I built the dam to protect the floodplain, not to serve as a backdrop for HOA kayaking parties. I filed a notice of reservoir expansion for ecological restoration, citing erosion caused by shoreline disruption, which the HOA had absolutely contributed to, and while they scrambled to challenge they couldn't. because I'd retained the original environmental use clause from 1991 that gave me full control of water levels in defense of shoreline sustainability. I kept everything quiet, even as I installed automated floodgates and reinforced the spillway, smiling as HOA board members watched from their decks, trying to figure out what the hell I was up to. They sent a cease and desist letter. I sent them a scanned copy of the original land patent, signed by a county judge, proving they had no jurisdiction to even walk on my shoreline without trespassing. Calm. And then, on a Friday morning just after sunrise, I opened the dams slowly at first, 2 inches an hour, nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, but enough to turn dry yards into soggy mud. Enough to send water creeping back toward the foundations they'd built too close to my lake. They panicked, of course, demanded emergency zoning intervention, tried to rally the homeowners, but I'd already informed the insurance companies that their properties were built on disputed land with pending water encroachment risks, and those companies dropped coverage faster than a cat in a rainstorm. Within 48 hours, pumps were running, basements were flooding, and reality was sinking in, literally, as the lake rose to reclaim the space that had once belonged to it. And me and I stood on the ridge, watching from my porch, sipping black coffee and reading the HOA's desperate emails, like fan mail from a bad comedy troupe, begging for an encore. They threatened legal action, and I welcomed it, because I had a binder full of evidence and a county judge who'd already reviewed my filings and said, "Honestly, Mr. Braxton, I'd have done the same thing." And with that, the battle shifted from panic to retreat, homeowners demanding refunds, investors backing out, and the once proud Marlow Lakeside HOA dissolving under the weight of lawsuits, repair bills, and public outrage. And that was just the beginning. And that was just the beginning, because as the lake rose, and the HOA floundered, I wasn't done, not by a long shot, because this wasn't just about flooding illegally built houses. It was about holding accountable every greedy hand that signed off on the theft of my land while I was stuck in a hospital bed, cut open and drugged up, completely unaware that my life's work was being paved over by opportunists with fake permits and freshly printed brochures. So I did what I'd always done in battle. I gathered intel, mapped the brain.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Done in battle. I gathered intel, mapped the brain, terrain, and dismantled the enemy piece by piece, and the next move came with the local news, a quiet tip to a reporter named Jenna, who had a reputation for loving stories that mixed corruption, manned, and government lies. I handed her a folder thick with forged signatures, falsified land plats, and photos showing just how brazen the development had been, including one aerial shot that showed houses straddling the old surveyor stakes I'd driven into the soil 20 years ago and marked with my initials. And when her story hit the Sunday edition under the headline, "Developer's Paradise Built on Stolen Land," all hell broke loose. Phones lit up at the county office. Residents started demanding title verifications. And Grant Ellison, the sow called HOA president, tried to spin the story as a clerical boundary miscommunication until someone leaked an internal memo showing he'd known for over a year that the land had been contested, but had instructed the board to proceed anyway, due to expected legal grey area and minimal pushback from an absentee landowner, as if I were some ghost buried in paperwork rather than a living man who'd bled into that soil. The worst part was realizing that many of the homeowners weren't even complicit. They'd been duped too. Sold homes on land that didn't legally exist in their name, and while I could have come after them with bulldozers and lawsuits, I aimed higher, at the snakes at the top of the food chain, the developers, the notaries, the county officer who had pushed the permits through, and one by one I filed complaints, served notices, and submitted claims to state regulators, triggering audits, reviews, and emergency zoning hearings that turned every meeting into a circus of finger-pointing and denial. Meanwhile, I kept raising the lake not fast enough to drown anyone or cause danger, but just enough to remind them every morning when they stepped out barefoot onto soggy patios or saw water pooling beneath their back porches that this lake wasn't theirs never had been, and was simply coming home. Contractors tried to build temporary levees, but my legal control of the shoreline meant they couldn't anchor anything without my permission, and when they tried to do it anyway, I had them arrested for trespassing. Their equipment impounded, their fines stacking up faster than the HOA's excuses. My attorney, a property rights specialist named Helen, who'd once sued a utility company into bankruptcy, advised me every step of the way. And together we filed an injunction demanding full restitution not just for illegal land use, but for environmental damage, shoreline erosion, water table disruption, and unauthorized dam adjacency. Which is legal jargon for you built next to my dam without permission, and now you're going to pay? By month 3, 4 houses had already been abandoned, their for sale signs sitting lopsided in waterlogged yards no bank would underwrite, and the rest of the community had begun to fracture, some blaming the yen. Who? Others blaming the county, and a few still dumb enough to glare at me like I was the problem. Like the man whose land was stolen should have smiled and accepted it just because their kids had swing sets and patio grills now sitting in standing water. But I didn't waste time arguing with them, because the storm was bubbia, already too big to stop. And the final blow came when the county land records were officially amended to reflect a pending reversal of ownership, and every single deed tied to the development was marked under review, effectively freezing their sake, ability to refinance, resell, or even get home insurance without disclosing a legal battle with the original landowner May, and at that point, the board folded. Grant tried to run, tried to sell his own home and disappear, but Helen filed a lien so fast, his real estate agent quit in protest. And when he showed up at a town hall meeting to explain his perspective, he was met with a crowd of angry homeowners, flashbulbs from news reporters, and a man with a megaphone reading excerpts from the forged signatures out loud, while everyone watched him squirm. By the end of that week, he resigned from the board, vacated his home, and vanished from the county altogether, and I stood once again on the ridge, overlooking the lake, watching the water sit high and proud where it had once been drained for footpaths and decorative rocks, and I knew the fight was far from over because legal proceedings still loomed, because the scars on the land would take years to heal, and because I'd lost something too. Peace, solitude, the quiet life I'd earned and had stolen, but I also knew I wasn't done fighting. Not until every lie had been exposed, every false deed erased, and every inch of my land returned to the hands that built it. Not the hands that stole it with PowerPoint presentations and handshake deals made behind closed doors. This was no longer just a property dispute. It was a war for ownership, for dignity, for the right to say, "This land is mine." And you can't pave over a man's legacy and expect him not to fight back. And the rising water wasn't just a flood, it was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. This storm didn't begin with more water or threats or headlines. It began in a courtroom, where silence stretched like piano wire across the benches as I walked in carrying the original deed to the property, the foundational survey maps, and a thick binder of every piece of evidence that had brought the entire fraudulent development crashing down. And I saw the fear in their eyes, not just the HOA board remnants, but the developers, the investors, even the former county land official who sat near the back trying to keep his head down like the guilt, wouldn't cling to him because this wasn't just about 35 illegal homes or forged signatures, or a dam opened calf. In defiance, this was about theft at scale, systemized under the veil of bureaucracy, and I was the wrong man to try it on, because they didn't just pick a landowner, they picked a craftsman, a combat veteran, and a man who believed that silence in the face of wrongdoing is its own kind of betrayal. The judge, a stern woman with more steel in her spine than anyone on that board, listened to my entire testimony without interrupting once, flipping through the documents as I spoke, occasionally glancing over her glasses at the defense table where the HOA's attorneys sat pale and sweating, their arguments crumbling faster than the eroding shoreline their clients had destroyed. And when the ruling came down, it was everything I'd worked for. Full restoration of my deeded ownership, invalidation of every single lot title tied to the illegal development, financial damages to cover it.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Tied to the illegal development, financial damages to cover environmental impact, legal fees, and an additional order forcing the remaining residents to either vacate within 60 days or purchase legal lease agreements from me at market rates under strict ecological guidelines which meant no more core. Manicured lawns, no motorboats, no fake fountains, and no HOA ever again. Some of them cursed me, called me a monster for displacing families. But the truth was, I gave them an option they never gave me. Fairness. They had a chance to stay, to pay for what had been stolen and rebuild honestly. And if that wasn't enough for them, then they never really belonged here anyway. The state filed criminal charges against Grant Ellison and the developer's lead contractor, both of who had profited directly from the scam, and when the indictment came down, it felt less like victory and more like cleansing, like finally scrubbing clean something that had stained the land with arrogance and greed. And then came the hard part, rebuilding, not with bulldozers or blueprints, but with patience, with fireweed and native trees, with shoreline buffers and proper drainage channels, because the lake had swallowed what didn't belong, but it needed help healing, and I gave it that. Working every morning at sunrise alongside volunteers from the nearby town who remembered when the lake was a place for fishing and peace, not HOA patrols and architectural review committees. They brought their kids, their shovels, their stories, and one day an old man named Earl, who used to fish with me back in the 90s, showed up with his grandson and said, "Glad you took it back. We all knew it was wrong. We just didn't think anyone would stand up." And I smiled at that, not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me that justice, real justice, rarely comes in one loud explosion, but in steady, deliberate waves that wash away the lies piece by piece. By month 4, most of the houses had been vacated or signed over to me, their owners choosing to cut their losses rather than deal with the liability of living on land built on fraud. And I repurposed the ones that remained, turned one into a lakeside nature center, another into a bunkhouse for trail volunteers, and 2 more into recovery cabins for veterans who needed solitude and water and sky more than they needed HOA welcome packets. The lake itself rose to its natural level, calm and wide, no longer forced into narrow compliance, but flowing free again, just like I'd built it decades ago. And with it came the birds, the frogs, the buzz of dragonflies in the heat of summer, a sound more honest than any courtroom victory. The media attention faded, the lawsuits wrapped up, and my life returned to its slower rhythm: coffee on the porch, repairs on the dock, carving wood in my shop with the windows open, and I found peace again, not just in silence, but in the knowledge that I hadn't let them win, hadn't let slick-talking thieves in polo shirts rewrite the boundaries of a life I built with my own hands. And every once in a while I walk the perimeter, just like I used to, boots crunching over dry pine needles and wet leaves, watching the water shift like muscle through the trees. And I think about how close they came to taking it all, and how satisfying it was to see it all come back, 1 inch at a time, not through violence or rage, but through something harder: proof, patience, and the immovable will of someone who simply refused to let his land be stolen. So when people ask if I regret opening the dam, I just smile and say, it wasn't vengeance, it was restoration. Because when the lake rose, it didn't just take back the shoreline, it took back the truth, and with it, everything that matters.